Hello students, I am your teacher from Takshila Model Senior Secondary School, and I'm back here again with a new lecture this time. And this time I'm going to give you the best learning opportunity on this platform, YouTube. So students, the topic that we are going to discuss today is a triumph of surgery. This is the chapter number 1 of the book, Footprints Without Feet. This chapter is written by Dr. James Harriet. Dr. James Harriet, who was a British 20th century writer and a veterinary surgeon. So students, in this chapter, we will read about a dog and his mistress, his rich mistress. So before I move on to the explanation of the part number 1 of this chapter, actually for your convenience, I'm going to divide this chapter into 2 parts so that we can understand each and every detail of this chapter. So students, for part 1, we are going to cover very important aspects of this chapter. Before we move on to the explanation, let me just give you a brief outline of the chapter, introduction of the chapter. So students, this chapter is about a little pet dog named Tricky. Tricky is pampered, is loved by his rich mistress named Mrs. Humphrey. These two names have been given in the character column, character list. So Mrs. Humphrey is the rich mistress of a little pet dog named Tricky. Mrs. Humphrey treats Tricky like her own son. She is always worried about his declining health. Mrs. Humphrey believes that Tricky is declining in health day by day, but actually it is not the case. Believing that Tricky is becoming weak day by day, she starts giving him extra food during his meals, and this turns the situation from bad to worse. Tricky becomes hugely fat and he seriously falls ill. It is when Dr. Harriet, who is a veterinary surgeon is a doctor for the animals, for the pet dogs, for the pet animals. So it is at that point of time Dr. Harriet comes and takes Tricky to his private surgery. At the surgery, Dr. Harriet, being a sensible doctor, does not give any kind of medicinal treatment to Tricky because he knows what the problem is with Tricky. He knows that Tricky is an overfed dog, and because of being overfed, he has become listless and he has become very weak. So after he gives Tricky only a plenty of water and lot of exercise to do, and after some days there is a magical change in Tricky. Tricky starts recovering. He starts gaining his strength. He starts gaining energy back. And when finally Dr. Harriet thinks that Tricky is absolutely alright now, he calls Mrs. Humphrey to collect Tricky. When Mrs. Humphrey comes over to the surgery and takes Tricky in her lap, she is delighted. She is excited to see Tricky absolutely fine. And it is that point of time she exclaims that it is a triumph of surgery. And here, let us now discuss the title of the chapter, a triumph of surgery. So students, the word triumph means victory. So Mrs. Humphrey believes that it is a victory over surgery. And what is surgery? Surgery is a medical process which involves incision to remove or repair any part of our body. So Mrs. Humphrey believes that it is a victory over surgery, but the truth is something else. We know the truth. Truth is that the Dr. Harriet, being a sensible and intelligent doctor, did not give Tricky any kind of medicinal treatment. He knew what Tricky was suffering from. Actually, Tricky was not suffering from malnutrition. He was only suffering from being overfed. So students, here we have come to know the outline of the chapter, and now we are going to the explanation of important points that I am going to write on the board. So students, let us now move on to the explanation of the points that I have written on the board. So students, here the point number 1, that is these 3 points we are going to discuss that are available on page number 1. So Dr. Harriet's worries. So students, the chapter begins with Dr. Harriet, who is in his car, and all of a sudden he sees Tricky along with his rich mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. When he sees them, he just pulls up his car. Pull up here means to stop. He pulls up his car, he stops his car and takes a look at the little pathetic animal. Who is little pathetic animal? That is Tricky. Dr. Harriet calls little pet Tricky a pathetic animal because Tricky is not looking fine. What is wrong with Tricky? Students, let us discuss. Tricky has become hugely fat. He looks like a blotted sausage. He has become hugely fat. He looks like a blotted sausage. Blotted here means swollen. Sausage here means a piece of meat. So he looks like a blotted sausage with one leg at each corner. Means he is just looking like a swollen piece of meat, and you just add one leg to each corner of that swollen meat. So he is looking hugely fat. He is excessively fat. So what is the other shortcoming in Tricky? His eyes are bloodshot and rheumy. Bloodshot means very red, and rheumy here means discharging a watery substance. So his eyes are red, as well as there is some watery substance coming out from his eyes. It shows that he is not physically well and fit. So students, we come to know that Dr. Harriet, when observes Tricky's health, he becomes very worried, and he finds that Tricky is not well, not fine. So what happens then? He talks to Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky's health, and Mrs. Pumphrey seems to give the explanation. And what is the explanation that Mrs. Pumphrey gives to Dr. Harriet about Tricky's health? Mrs. Pumphrey tells that Tricky was very listless. He was just not taking his meals at right times. He refused his favorite chocolates and favorite food. Mrs. Pumphrey thought that Tricky was suffering from malnutrition. He was looking very weak, and she started giving him extra during his meals. And why did she start giving him extra food during his meals? She wanted to build up his strength. She believed that Tricky was becoming weak day by day. In order to make him sleep at night, she also used to give him what? A bowl of Horlicks. Apart from that, she used to give him cod liver oil and malt. So malt, cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night she used to give him. And she used to give him all these eatables in order to make up his strength, in order to build up his strength. And what is the outcome of this excessive diet that Mrs. Pumphrey was giving to Mrs. Pumphrey was giving to Tricky? The outcome of this doubt was that Tricky became hugely fat, and he became seriously ill, and that his eyes became rheumy, bloodshot, and he looked like a blotted sausage. He had difficulty in walking, and sometimes he also used to have bouts of vomiting, and he appeared like a listless dog. Listless here means listless here means seems uninteresting in the things around. So Mrs. Pumphrey says that she has taken Tricky out for a walk. It is when Dr. Harriet asks Mrs. Pumphrey 2 questions. What is the first question? You can just find it out in your textbooks if you are having them in front of you. So the first question that Dr. Harriet asks Mrs. Pumphrey is, did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Cut down here means to stop the flow. or to decrease the amount of something. So did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? And what is the reply that Mrs. Pumphrey gives? Mrs. Pumphrey explains that she could not be so strict. She had to relent. Relent here means she had to appear less savior. She had to be very lenient about cutting down on his diet. And it was so because she believed that Tricky was very weak and he was not gaining his strength back. That is why she did not cut down on his sweet things. What is the second question that Dr. Harriet asks Mrs. Pumphrey? The second question is, are you giving him plenty of exercise? This is the second question that Dr. Harriet asks Mrs. Pumphrey. And what is the answer that Mrs. Pumphrey gives to this question? The answer is that she tries to explain away the reasons why she is not able to give Tricky a lot of exercise besides the walks, besides the morning walks that she is giving to Tricky. So she says that there has not been ring throwing nowadays. Ring throwing is a very common exercise for pet animals. In this exercise, what happens? A person throws a rubbered ring away, and the dog or any animal or any pet dog runs behind that, runs after that particular ring and grabs it and takes it back to the master or owner. So this is called ring throwing exercise. So this exercise was given to Tricky by their gardener named Hodgkin. So Mrs. Pumphrey tells that Hodgkin, their gardener, is not well. He has been down with lumbago. Lumbago here is a state of illness in which a person feels extreme lower back pain. So Mrs. Pumphrey tells Dr. Harriet that their gardener Hodgkin is not well. He has been down with lumbago, and that is why he's unable to give him ring throwing exercises. So what is the only thing that Tricky is having in terms of exercise now? He's just having little walks with his mistress. So students, these are the two questions that Dr. Harriet asks Mrs. Pumphrey, and she tries to give the explanation. So with these two questions, the content, the text at page number 1 ends, and now let us move on to page number 2. So on page number 2, the first point number, we can call it first or fourth. I'm going in chronological order, so I'll call it fourth point. So Dr. Harriet's advice. When Dr. Harriet listens to Mrs. Pumphrey giving all these explanations, he again gets very worried. He feels quite worried about Tricky's deteriorating health. He advises Mrs. Pumphrey and tells that she has to be quite strict this time, and she just has to follow all those pieces of advice that he gave her, and that she has to harden her heart, and she has to decrease the amount of food that Tricky is consuming at this time, and that she has to follow the strictest regime. And what was the effect of this advice that Dr. Harriet gave to Mrs. Pumphrey? Mrs. Pumphrey tried to follow this regime into practice. This new regime here means a new schedule into practice. So students, let us now move on to the explanation of next point. So students, when Mrs. Pumphrey sets off with little dog Tricky, it is Mr. Harriet who takes another look at Tricky and what he takes for his observation. This is the point number 5, which is available at page number 2. The text available at page number 2. So point number 5 says Dr. Harriet's observation. So when Mrs. Pumphrey when Mrs. Pumphrey goes away having a conversation with Dr. Harriet, this is Dr. Harriet who takes another look at the dog, and he finds that Tricky is extremely ill, and he finds that Tricky is facing a lot of problems in walking. He is tottering in his little tweed coat. Totter here means to stagger. To stagger. Stagger here means to walk with unsteady steps. So Dr. Harriet finds Tricky tottering in his little tweed coat. Tweed coat. Tweed here means woolen. So Tricky is walking with unsteady steps in his little woolen coats. Dr. Harriet comes to know that Tricky has a full wardrobe of such woolen coats for the cold days, and he has raincoats for the rainy days, for the wet days. Uh, Next, Dr. Harriet comes to know, Dr. Harriet observes that Tricky is drooping in harness. Drooping means bending low, bending his head low. Drooping in harness. Harness means ornamental covering. Ornamental covering. Students, take a look at this ornamental covering. What do you think ornamental covering is? Ornamental covering means, as we come to know, as we have read in this chapter, that Tricky's mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, is a very rich lady. So Mrs. Pumphrey also pampers Tricky like her own son, and she gives him very good clothes especially. So here ornamental covering can include the strap, very expensive strap, or the very expensive cloths that Tricky is wrapped in. So Dr. Harriet finds that Tricky is drooping in harness. In harness means with his ornamental covering, he is just walking with very dull steps. Dr. Harriet believes that Mrs. Pumphrey will soon call him about Tricky's deteriorating health, and very soon Dr. Harriet receives a call from Mrs. Pumphrey. Mrs. Pumphrey is very distraught. Distraught here means very sad. Very sad. She reports to Dr. Harriet that Tricky has refused even his favorite dishes. Apart from that, he's having bouts of vomiting, means he's having vomiting at times. And that he has stopped taking interest in his surrounding. He spends most of his time lying on a rug. Rug, what is a rug? Rug is a piece of cloth. A piece of cloth. So he spends most of his time lying on a rug. So Dr. Harriet now just becomes very strict, and he makes his plans already in advance. So Dr. Harriet makes his plans in advance. Now we come to page number 3. This is point number 7, Dr. Harriet's plans. So Dr. Harriet now makes his plans in advance. He knows that very soon he will receive a call from Mrs. Pumphrey, and that is why he tells Mrs. Pumphrey that the time has come when Tricky must be taken away to the surgery, because Tricky is seriously ill. And if this does not happen within the wake of time, Tricky will be extremely ill, and that the treatment will be out of their control. So taking this strict action, Dr. Harriet doesn't try to waste his time. And as soon as Mrs. Pumphrey listens to this strict advice of Dr. Harriet, she feels swooned. Swooned here means she feels fainted. She feels like being fainted. Here, swoon means to faint. So Mrs. Pumphrey becomes uncontrollable with emotions, and she believes that Tricky will die if he just does not see Mrs. Pumphrey every day. But Dr. Harriet becomes very strict this time, and he says that this is the only solution to Tricky's deteriorating health, that he must be transported or taken away to the surgery. So students, this is now point number 8, departure of Tricky. This is also present at the text, present at page number 2. Page number 3, departure of Tricky. So when finally Mrs. Pumphrey also comes down with this strictest advice of Dr. Harriet, they start making plans to send Tricky away to this surgery with Dr. Harriet. So the time comes and Dr. Harriet takes Tricky in his arms wrapped in a blanket. He puts Tricky in his car, and he just sees that the staff of the household and the maids all are very sad, very upset. The maids are engaged in bringing various things that belong to Tricky, and these various things include his toys, his rubber rings, and uh, his his day bed, his night bed, his ball of breakfast, ball of lunch, ball of supper. So there are a lot of things that Tricky uses. So with all these things, the maids come out and try to put these things into Dr. Harriet's car. Dr. Harriet finally realizes that this much of stuff would not go into his car. He realizes that his car will not hold this much of stuff, so he starts driving away his car. Finally, he finds that Mrs. Humphrey, in tears, come with a armful of little coats for Tricky, and she throws those coats into Dr. Harriet's car. So Dr. Harriet now drives away, and he takes the final look at the people of the house, Mrs. Pumphrey, maids, and all the staff, and he finds that all are weeping and all are in tears. So this is a very emotional situation. Here we come to know that Tricky was a very favorite dog of the people, especially Mrs. Pumphrey. So friends, with this point number 8, this lecture, especially the part 1, ends here, and we will discuss the remaining things of the chapter in part number 2.